You've started to do things differently. You're setting boundaries, you're putting your needs out there, but it's making your relationships worse. If that's you, you're not alone. In this video, we're going to talk about when codependency recovery actually makes our relationships worse for a while. But if you're new, my name's Michelle Ferris. I'm a psychotherapist and I love helping people create relationships that work. So maybe you're having a challenge with a family member, your mom, your sister, a friend, and you expect things to get better because you're in recovery and you're doing this work. But instead you get met with resistance, or maybe they're ghosting you, or you just don't have the relationship you want to have with them yet. So I had a conflict with someone this week, and it really demonstrates this point that sometimes our relationships actually get worse before they get better. Let me explain. A friend and I had a disagreement about something, and afterwards she ghosted me. I tried reaching out a couple of times, left her a few messages, and I got no response back. Let's remember that sometimes when people aren't in recovery of their own, they tend to withdraw during conflict. And it's important to remember that sometimes when we're in conflict with people who don't do this work, they might avoid the conflict like we used to, or they might ghost us. And we need to have some compassion because sometimes it reminds us of what we used to do. So after waiting a few weeks, I finally called the person and they answered. We had a conversation. And the weird thing was they acted like everything was fine. And right at that moment, I knew I had a choice to make. I could either ignore it like they were and pretend everything was fine, or listen to my gut, which was telling me this is going to come back to bite me if I don't face it. Because I know from my own codependency recovery that when I ignore my feelings, they only get bigger. And then they come out in really hurtful ways that I don't expect because they're too hard to manage at that point. So I didn't want to do that. So I took a risk and brought it up. So what I said was, I really want to acknowledge that we had a disagreement about a month ago, and I know it was hard for both of us, but I really want us to get past that. And if you want to talk about it, or if there's anything left unsaid, I'm open to what you want to say. And she basically came back and said, nope, I said everything I wanted to say during the conflict. And I could tell the door was absolutely shut. And this was kind of surprising, but I tried one last time and I said, listen, I just want to let you know that this is important to me. That didn't do much either. So basically at that point, I had to accept it, let them, and used the let them theory from Mel Robbins because I knew I couldn't make her shift. I couldn't make her want to talk about it. That would have been a boundary violation on my part. And sometimes that's how relationships get worse in codependency recovery, is that we're willing to acknowledge the problem, but they're not. They're not ready. They might be afraid. They might not have the tools to communicate and to stay calm during a conflict, or to even share how hurt they are. And I had to respect that, because if you've been in codependency recovery, you know that there was probably a time when you shied away from conflict and didn't want to deal with it. Sometimes it's important to remember and accept that person for where they're at in this moment. So what worked and what didn't? What worked is I came prepared. I was reading the book, The Let Them Theory by Mel Robbins, and that was perfect timing for me because it reminded me of what I can control and what I can't. So I went into that conversation grounded and centered. I gave myself enough time to do my journaling, talk it out with friends before I made that phone call. The other thing I realized was I needed to go in with an open heart. I didn't want to go in with a chip on my shoulder like, hey, you've hurt me and I have justifiable anger against you, because I knew that wasn't going to fly, especially with someone who isn't in recovery, because the conflict tends to be a lot more sensitive and prickly to navigate because they don't have the tools I do. So that made me really want to be mindful going into this conflict, because I knew leading with my justifiable anger wasn't going to work and it could potentially dissolve that relationship, and I didn't want that. The next thing I did that worked was acknowledge the disagreement. She was able to hear it, she just wasn't willing to dive deeper into it and actually have a conversation. But the fact that I acknowledged it and didn't pretend everything was okay was a huge win for me, because I know in my gut that wasn't going to work. The last thing I did was I let myself get vulnerable and share that, hey, this relationship really matters to me. Even though she wasn't really open, I stayed in my center with an open heart. I didn't go in with expectations that she needs to meet me halfway or she needs to open up, because I knew there was a distinct possibility that was not going to happen. Because when people don't do their own work, it's really hard to navigate conflict, and I have compassion for that because I remember how hard it was to navigate conflict before I was in recovery. If you're struggling with a conflict right now, say me too in the comments. This video is going to help. So what didn't work? Well, their response. They shut me down pretty quickly and said they absolutely did not want to talk about it. And that really hurt because I was really hoping to get some resolution, which led to the second thing that didn't work, is having expectation. I was really hoping to get further along in that conflict. But what I also had to remember was that they didn't have the tools to do that. So it was most likely going to be unrealistic for me to expect us to have a really open dialogue about what happened. The next thing I did that didn't work is I waited too long to phone her back. I probably could have waited 2 weeks because she hadn't responded and I didn't want to intrude. But when I finally did call her back, I had a month of stewing about it, and it was too long for me, because the longer we wait to have these conversations, the more our negative thinking gets control of us and creates a really negative story of us being the victim that really doesn't serve us in the long run. I know for me, it just gets me into justifiable anger, and it doesn't help the relationship in any way. In fact, it can actually hurt the relationship because I'm not focused on healing that relationship. I'm focused on being right, which is never the goal in recovery. Now, the other thing about why recovery can make our relationships worse for a while is that we're changing the game by starting to speak up, by setting healthy boundaries, by acting different. And often the other person who hasn't done the work is taken off guard. They might feel threatened by our changes because they don't know what to do. Suddenly the rules have changed. They're used to us always saying yes. They're used to us going with the flow if you're struggling with codependency and pleasing them over ourselves. So we have to allow the people in our lives to get used to these changes. And if they have a reaction that's negative, they're entitled to that. They may not like the changes we're doing in recovery because it threatens their own ecosystem of not wanting to feel feelings and deal with conflict. Because if the people in our lives want to have more superficial conversations, not deal with problems as they arise, then they're at a totally different frequency than you are. If you're doing this work, you're wanting to have more authentic connections, and that takes being vulnerable. And that means taking a risk and saying, hey, you hurt my feelings, or this didn't feel good to me, can we talk it out? And not everybody in life is willing to do that. Not everybody in recovery is willing to do that. Sometimes being able to be honest and navigate a conflict takes years in recovery before we're willing to do that. And that's okay. Recovery looks different for everyone, depending on your history, depending on your level of trauma, depending on your fear of that other person. There might be other things that are getting in the way, like negative self-talk and assuming the worst. And let's face it, the other person may not want to look at their behavior. And again, that's okay. It really helped that I had just read the Let Them Theory book by Mel Robbins, because it again reminds me of what is in my control, which is my reactions to that person, how I started the conversation, and how I ended it. Because I could have gotten into a lot of negative reaction based on her shutting me down, but I didn't. I had compassion because I knew I really wanted to keep that friendship because there's a lot of good in it. But this is a sticking point, and I had to acknowledge and give her the grace to be where she's at. So the next step I want you to do is I want you to go watch my video that I did on the Let Them Theory book by Mel Robbins, because it is such an amazing way to deal with conflict. Thanks so much.